This is my Eye of Winter Arcanist brand Pathfinder for deep delving up to 6k depth. It's a character made specifically for deep delving, but can also be used as Uberbosser. My current setup has around 500 million DPS in perfect conditions and can tank the Uber Maven memory game. The offensive part of the build is based around the Eye of Winter Arcanist brand concept popularized by Jung Rowan at this league. You will find the link to his video in the video description. Let's start off with the offensive part of the build. I'm gonna explain to you how the Eye of Winter Arcanist brand interaction together with returning projectiles works and what the numbers are that you need to get consistent returns. First of all, Eye of Winter. Eye of Winter is a projectile spell that shoots out a single projectile that constantly fires small shards coming from the main projectile and at the end explodes in a nova, casting I think 8 projectiles in total at the end. Since all of these single projectiles are fired in sequence, every single projectile that actually hits an enemy can damage it, so it has shotgunning potential. Adding the Nemesis ring to Eye of Winter allows the main projectile to return and allows the small projectile shards to return after they've hit their maximum projectile distance. However, without Arcanist brand, this maximum projectile distance is so far that the projectile is not able to return without at least around 400% projectile speed. In the background footage, you can see me shooting Eye of Winter without Arcanist brand with a Nemesis equipped. However, nearly none of the projectiles are returning, only when the Eye of Winter is hitting a wall, then it returns. Arcanist brand helps to solve this problem. Arcanist brand has a line that reads, projectiles from supported skills have 4.8 meters maximum range. This maximum range overrides the maximum range of Eye of Winter and allows it to return much sooner. With Arcanist brand, you only need around 130% additional projectile speed to get the returns to all fully hit the mob again if you are perfectly standing under a mob. However, for more consistent results, and especially during delving and when your brand is not targeting an enemy directly under you, it's advised to get around 180% projectile speed to be more consistent. In the background footage, you can see me cast one Arcanist brand together with around 180% projectile speed, and you can see all of the large projectiles are returning and all of the small projectiles are returning to me. Now that we have the offensive mechanics out of the way, let's talk about actually scaling the offenses of the build. First of all, the Ascendancy node Nature's Reprisal, giving us 25% chance to inflict Wither for 2 seconds on hit and 50% increased Wither effect, granting a ton of increased damage taken to the enemies. And with our amount of hits, Wither will always be stacked up to maximum of 15. However, to utilize this Wither effect, we need to convert the cold damage of Eye of Winter to Chaos, and there is no better way to do it other than Original Sin. Original Sin also has the added benefit of the line nearby enemies' chaos resistance is 0, which allows us to not use Despair on this build. The second way of actually scaling our damage is going crit based with a lot of crit multi-jewels together with a fully pushed Flask effect Bottled Faith, Brittle Boots and Assassin's Mark. All of this combined allows me to reach a crit chance of 100% together with a crit multi of 419%. I'm also utilizing Focus as another damage scaling mechanic. Since the Focus mod on gloves, 50% increased attack and cast speed while focused is a very big buff to the frequency of activation of Arcanist brand, together with the 15% chance to deal double damage while focus mod on the weapon, allows me to create big burst windows, especially for bosses. The next way of scaling offense is of course utilizing Righteous Fire. Righteous Fire grants 41% more spell damage, and while Righteous Fire grants another 21% more spell damage, which is perfect for bosses after intermissions to nuke them together with focus. Sustaining Righteous Fire is not an issue at all during normal gameplay, since we have a fully Flask effect push Bottled Faith, granting a big consecrated ground for a lot of regen, together with a lot of leech and instant leech, making us never lose life from Righteous Fire during normal gameplay. A staple for delve builds that focus on phase tanking is the Natural Affinity Small Cluster Jewel. It grants the Nature's Patient Keystone, which grants you 2% chance to deal double damage and 1% less damage taken per Grasping Vine, which can stack up to 10 times over 5 seconds while standing still. One of the most important things for scaling offense is enabled by the Journey Tattoo of Makanui, granting the ability to transform any keystone into any other one. We use this to transform Perfect Agony into Runebinder, which would otherwise be on the other side of the passive tree. Runebinder allows us to attach 2 brands to a single target, basically granting us double damage. Other ways of scaling damage on this build include scaling the number of active brands, which is very important for Delve nodes, via the brand equity notable and the brand mastery that grants 2 additional brands. We are pushing gem levels to up to level 33 on Eye of Winter. We get power and frenzy charges from Assassin's Mark plus the Mark mastery. We get onslaught on kill from boots, which is always up during Delve nodes. We get unnerf from the gloves. We get Alchemist Genius permanently from the belt. And we are stacking Pierce for better damage during crowded Delve nodes. Now, let's get into the fun and complex part of the build, and that is explaining the defenses. This is a Transcendence build. Transcendence is currently the strongest form of mitigation for elemental and physical hits. Transcendence allows armor to be applied to fire, cold, and lightning damage taken from hits instead of physical damage. The downside is minus 15% to all maximum elemental resistances. The first downside of the minus 15 to all Illures can be mitigated by wearing a Lore Weave. Lore Weave overrides this minus 15% by setting all of our maximum resistances to 78. The second downside of armor no longer applying to physical damage means we need another way of mitigating physical damage, since physical damage is over half of the damage you take while delving. This is done by getting 100% physical to elemental damage conversion. We are doing this by getting 31% from the Taste of Hate flask, 24% from a double Purity of Elements conversion Watcher's Eye, 18% from the helmet, with 10% being from the drop-only modifier from Corel in Betrayal, and 8% from the Implicit, and a corrupted Dawnbringer for another 28% physical to elemental damage conversion, totaling to 101% physical to elemental damage conversion. To complete the Transcendence Lore Weave trifecta is the Eternal Damnation Amulet. It is back this league again with Sanctum returning. It grants gain additional elemental damage reduction equal to half your chaos resistance, and with our chaos resistance of 78%, we get 39% elemental damage reduction from this. This 39% elemental damage reduction is additive together with the elemental damage reduction from hits we get from Transcendence. This means we do not actually need that much armor to get to another 90% damage reduction post resistances. If we add this all together, we are taking only 22% of the damage because of our 78% maximum resistance from elemental or physical hits. And from these 22%, we then subtract a further 90% because of our physical damage mitigation plus our Eternal Damnation Amulet, which means we are taking only 2.2% of the damage we took from the total damage. This is then scaled even further for cold and for fire resistance by using the Taste of Hate flask and the Ruby flask, which both grant 20% less cold and fire damage taken respectively, which is scaled by flask effect as well. Since our Ruby flask has a flask effect of over 130%, we are gaining around 50% additional fire damage reduction after all of our previous Transcendence mitigation, which means from this 2.2% of damage, we are only taking around 1% of fire damage in total. Same with cold. Lightning damage, we're taking a bit more since I'm currently not running a lightning flask, but lightning damage does not have any really big hits in Delve. To get enough armor for the Transcendence to be even worth it, I'm running Determination. Determination, together with one flask suffix of 60% increased armor during effect on a slightly buffed quartz flask, is enough armor to grant me 31k armor, which is plenty for most hits in this game. You have to remember, this armor is way more effective, since if armor normally is applying to physical damage, you don't have any mitigation before you get the actual hit. However, since we are applying it to our elemental damage, we are getting a 78% reduction before armor is taking effect. So our armor is way more effective versus elemental damage than versus physical damage normally. As an additional defensive layer, I'm running Spell Suppression. I'm getting a total of 100% Spell Suppression with 38% from gear on 3 slots, 24% from a quartz flask, and 39% from one wheel on the tree. As last big defensive layer, I'm running Progenesis. Progenesis is a staple in all high-budget Pathfinder builds, with granting 25% of life loss from damage taken occurs over 4 seconds instead. However, this 25% is actually scalable by Flask effect, which I'm doing by a lot in this build. I have 110% Flask effect for Progenesis, which grants me over 50% of life loss from damage taken occurs over 4 seconds instead, basically doubling my health pool for any one-shots. To mitigate the downside of Progenesis, we need a lot of life recovery. To do this in this build, we are utilizing the Leech Mastery introduced in 3.21, which reads 10% of Leech is instant. Utilizing the implicits from the gloves, 0.6% of chaos damage leached as life, we can leech chaos damage as life. And since Arcanist Brand Eye of Winter fires a ton of projectiles, we're hitting a ton of times, and instant leech scales of the amount of hits that we do. Since, for example, if we are leeching 800 for each hit that we do, we gain 10% of that as instant leech, which gives us 80 life each time we hit, which is basically 80 life gain on hit, with around 80 projectiles on single targets is basically infinite recovery, especially during crowded delve nodes. Let's talk about the tattoos that I used in this build. Of course, as mentioned earlier, I'm using the Keystone tattoo to turn Perfect Agony into Runebinder. As next big tattoo, I'm using the Honor tattoo of the Wise to turn the 30 intelligence node near the ranger start into +1 to level of all intelligence gems. For the small dexterity nodes, I'm using nearly all projectile speed nodes tattoos until I hit 180%. All remaining intelligence and dexterity nodes are covered with +2% max life tattoos until I can fit no more. If you want, instead of running the max life tattoos, you can actually run the crit reduction tattoos on the intelligence node. But in my opinion, crits are not that important in Delve. I'm also utilizing 2 big of the 7 adjacent passive skills tattoos, the tattoo of the Tavahoa Makanga, which each grant 8% increased effect of flasks on you. I'm also doubling both of these tattoos utilizing the Warrior's Tail Crimson Jewel introduced in this league, which grants 100% increased effect of tattoos in radius. The last thing I want to cover in this guide is actually the gear, especially the rare pieces and how to craft them. Starting off with the boots. This high budget boots variant has an abyssal socket as well, but if you don't want it, you can also opt for life regeneration instead, which is a bit easier to hit. Here I used Fractured T1 Life and then used 4 socket resonators together with an abyssal fossil to block nearly everything but spell suppression and try to hit T3 plus spell suppression. You can then lock the suffixes and reforge chaos to hit any tier of chaos resistance. Here I think we need around 25% plus to cap our chaos resistance. If you have that, you can roll the remaining prefixes either with suffixes cannot be changed plus veiled chaos to hit the Unveiled Onslaught move speed or the hybrid life and evasion armor, or you can just craft it using Eldritch currency. For the gloves, you want to buy a base with T1 Fractured Spell Suppression, and then you want to spam Veiled Chaos Orbs until you hit the T1 Strength plus the Focus mod, and then craft the prefixes via Eldritch currency. At the end, I would craft the projectiles Pierce another target craft, since Pierce is very important in Delve. If you want to go bossing with this build, you do not need this craft, you can use any other craft instead. The helmet can be a bit expensive to craft, because you want the Fractured Drop-Only Corel mod, 10% of physical damage from hits taken as fire damage, which can only appear if this helm was actually dropped in a map from Betrayal. You then need to self-fracture this mod, as it is the only conversion mod that is actually a prefix. The Delve mod that actually has the same wording as this is a suffix and will not work. After you have the base, you then want to give it to an enchant service to get the enchant of Eye of Winter fires charge projectiles with 12% increased frequency during flight, or the 40% Eye of Winter damage. Both enchants are nearly the same DPS. After that, you want to use Loathing Essences to hit T1 spell suppression with mana reservation and an open suffix. You can then lock the suffixes again and reforge Lightning, Cold or Fire to hit either of the one's resistances, and you want to hit T1 resistance here. If you hit any other resistance, you can just swap it to Lightning. And the remaining prefix you then craft with Eldritch Currency to T1 life, and then craft the Projectiles Pierce craft again. Very important here, as prefix, you want the physical damage from hits taken as element at 8%, so it's excellent. The element which you do here does kind of matter, but not really. Cold is the best one, but just use any which you get if you are low on budget. The weapon craft can be rather complicated, so if you don't have a synthesis base, I would recommend crafting on a fractured +1 cold spell skills base. You can then get the +2 with 4-socket resonators, try to hit a good spell damage roll as well, then craft the suffixes via reforge caster ones to hit either spell crit or cast speed, and then Ashling Veil cast speed most likely, then craft the double damage. There are a few options. You can also go for a multi-mod suffix at the end if your budget is lower. Just adjust to your budget. For the belt, you want to buy yourself a Stygian Vice with the enchant already on it. Should cost around 1 divine. The hits against enemies unnerved by you have 50% increased crit chance. After that, you want to spam Horror Essences to get the Alchemist Genius mod until you hit any T1 Flask suffix. Just need one, either Flask charges gained, Flask duration, or reduced Flask charges used. Either of those in T1 is fine. You then want to multimod into lock suffix, then reforge life until you hit a good life roll. Personally, I settle for T3+. Then you want to Ashling 50-50 until you have the Flask charges gained into a Flask effect mod, which is guaranteed if you block armor and evasion. And as last step, you want to slam a Hunter Exalt. Any outcome is fine. You can get either life percent, chaos damage, or the Flask charge on crit. Any of those is fine. If you do not get the Flask charge on crit, remember you need to spec the Flask Mastery for 25% chance to gain a Flask charge on crit. For the Ascendancy choices, we are pretty cookie cutter build. We're using the Nature's Reprisal since we're doing chaos damage and Wither is pretty OP. Then we're using Nature's Adrenaline to get us our Perma Flasks. We're using Nature's Boon to get 30% increased flask effect on the Ruby and the Quartz Flask. And then we are grabbing 2 small nodes for another 10% increased flask effect for all of our flasks. For the flask setup, I'm using the Taste of Hate for the physical damage conversion, the Progenesis for Progenesis effect of course as defensive layer, the Ruby Flask to get fire resistance, and I need a flask with increased effect as well for the reduced mana cost of skills to get my mana cost to 1. I'm using a Quartz Flask for phasing and to cap suppression, and I'm using the Bottled Faith for capping my crit chance and for the increased damage taken. For mapping or gathering sulfite, I'm currently swapping the Bottled Faith with a Quicksilver Flask with move speed to be a bit faster. I'm gonna quickly go over all of the gem setups that I'm using. Let's start with the 6-link. We're using Arcanist Brand and Anomalous Eye of Winter for projectile speed, Anomalous Inspiration for mana cost and some crit chance, then an Empower, an Ally Focus, and a Void Manipulation. Blank Aura setup in our gloves, we're using Sedatory, Purity of Elements, and Determination, linked with an Enlighten 4. And the helmet, I'm using a 4-link cast when damage taken setup to trigger my Molten Shell and my Assassin's Mark, so I don't have to cast it manually, together linked with an Inspiration to manage the mana costs. And the boots, I only have a 3-link because the 4th is an Abyssal socket. I'm using Righteous Fire and Smite, Divergent and Phantasmal respectively, linked with an Enhance to push the DPS a bit. For mobility skills in my weapon, I'm using Frostblink Shield Charge, and I'm also fitting the Defiance banner here. In my offhand, I have my Divine Blessing setup with Inspiration and Hatred, using Divergent Inspiration here to get the mana cost to 0. I think that was everything. If you have any more questions about the build, feel free to leave them in the YouTube comments down below. I will try to answer all of them. Otherwise, feel free to like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more showcases of this build and the other builds in the future, hopefully uploading a bit more. Otherwise, have a good day and see you on the next one. Bye bye.